If I learned anything about the last session, it's to leave time for questions. If it was just as lively, if this session is just as lively as last session, they're going to have a really good time. But thank you all so much for, one, attending our annual conference. It's really good to see you all and see your faces in person. Even with masks on, I can feel your energy, and that's so cool. My name is Joshua Devine. I'm the Director of Racial Economic Equity at NCRC. I am joined by two of these distinguished gentlemen, Daniel Okonkwo and Ariel Meyerstein, who will share a little bit about themselves and their work in just a bit. But thank you all for joining our conversation today. I want to provide just a little bit of a housekeeping rules. We will do a question and answer after our discussion today. We welcome questions for those who are interested in asking them with the mic that you see in the middle of the room. But there's also our conference app. If you go into the app, click on this particular section or session, you'll see a section that says live Q&A. As we engage in conversation, we welcome you to submit your questions through the conference app, and I'll do my best as a moderator to make sure that we are answering your questions and leaving enough time for conversation here. I also think it's really important before we start to set some context for why this conversation is so important today. So as I mentioned, I head up our racial economic equity team, and we are charged with really helping our members, helping stakeholders, helping partners really understand racial wealth, racial inequality, the challenges and opportunities that exist within this space, and the solutions really to help bridge our nation's racial wealth divide. And we do this through a number of ways. We support research and analysis that helps contextualize the issues that we're facing now and how the solutions that are being piloted or programmed is actually making an impact locally. We have a really cool research team that we partner closely with, as well as members like yourselves who are doing really interesting work on the ground. We also do a lot of wealth building incubation, I like to call it, where we kind of discover and explore where there are unique models of wealth building strategies and solutions happening on the ground. Once we discover those strategies, our goal and intent then is to figure out how do we resource those models, how do we scale them, how do we provide the necessary resources and infrastructure for communities who are seeking to replicate those models to do so. So that's also a part of our mission and part of our job here. So if you are thinking about cooperatives to support immigrant entrepreneurs as they're doing some really cool work in Twin Cities, shout out to those folks who are in that area. Or if you're thinking about procurement and government contracting, how to connect small businesses to those opportunities, some really cool things happen in Atlanta. Shout out to those folks who are in that particular region. Our job is to figure out, okay, what's working well in this space and how do we replicate and scale? We also work with our corporate partners across the organization to ensure that equity is not only framed in the right way, but investments and programs and products and services are actually meeting the needs of the communities that we are advocating for. A few years ago, we developed a racial and ethnic representation and investment framework to really help us guide this work. And across this framework are 5 key pillars that we do our best to incorporate as we do our work in policy, in research, in advocacy, and in organizing. We support the work of corporations who are interested in really supporting diversity across their teams, whether that be in management, in C-suite executives, and even at the board level, knowing that if they're centering equity at the governance side of things, then that can lead, and we hope that it can lead to tangible, equitable products, services, and design, and impacting communities that we're advocating for. The second pillar really is around equitable products and services. We want to make sure that as we are, as institutions are seeking to provide services and resources to economically vulnerable and historically disenfranchised households and communities, that we do this well. So we use our research to inform that particular work and that particular design. We also work closely with our partners to ensure that there's some sort of equity framework that's guiding the work, whether it's workforce diversity within their organization or perhaps procurement or diverse supply chains, for example. We have an incredible policy shop that's been advocating for policy reform and new policies to really center around ensuring that we are addressing racial wealth and racial inequality in America and in the communities that we're serving. And then lastly, we really seek to guide philanthropic investments in financial community investments, targeting to communities of color and communities that need that funding the most. So we utilize, again, our research and our intel, our power of our convening to really support and align resources where needed. And today's conversation will be around philanthropy and investments. We are currently this year working on a project to help understand the landscape of corporate equity commitments that have been committed by institutions over the past few years, particularly in light or post George Floyd and during the nation's racial reckoning. Not only are we working to summarize or really summarize how much of these monetary commitments were made, but really explore in partnership what has been working over the past 2 years since that time. What commitments have been made? What impact is it making on the ground? What models, resources, what lessons learned can we gather to really support organizations like yourselves who are interested in thinking about getting closely connected to these investments, but also working with our partners to think about what does the future look like? What are we learning now that we could use and pivot accordingly in the future? It is our hope by the end of this year that we will really be able to establish a set of resources and tools that will support you all, as well as our corporate partners, as we all work towards this fight to advance racial equity. So our 2 sessions today focus on corporate responsibility. Our next session in the afternoon will be primarily focused on products and service innovation. Our partners at Beneficial State Foundation will be facilitating a conversation with M&T Bank and Barclays about some of their programs that they're utilizing that they believe are confidently addressing racial wealth and closing racial gaps and ensuring access to financial services and inclusion. So that's the next session. This particular session, we want to take a kind of a high-level overview, if you will, of just corporate racial equity commitments overall, and really talk with my fellow panelists here about their methods, how are they investing in communities, how are they ensuring that these investments are aligned with local needs in the community, how are they measuring their impact, what is that philosophy, what's that approach they're taking, and then what do they see are priorities in the future. And then hopefully the conversation that we have today is useful to you all who will be in attendance. So, without further ado, I do want to give some time for our panelists to introduce themselves, share a little bit about their work, kind of their racial equity commitment portfolio, and then we'll just take it over from there. So I'll go with Daniel, and then we'll start with next Ariel.
Great. Is this on? Can everyone hear me? All right, great. Well, first of all, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Washington, D.C. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Washington, D.C. Thank you. Just want to make sure we're all, I know these rooms can get hot. I just want to make sure everyone's awake. My name is Daniel Okonkwo. I am the East Region Executive at JPMorgan Chase and our JPMorgan Chase Foundation. So I lead our strategies and philanthropic investments on the East Coast in a region that spans from Massachusetts to Miami. And again, thank you all for coming to this important conversation. I think that this is an opportunity for us to have a dialogue that sometimes we don't often get as proximate to each other. So I'm grateful to be here and grateful to NCRC for this opportunity. When we talk about racial equity commitments, I think one thing to recognize is it's important that we're actually saying those words. And I think at JPMorgan Chase, we made this commitment in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the country's racial reckoning, like many other corporations. And I think what we overall are trying to do is make sure that our engagement in this area is not just philanthropic, but that it becomes part of our corporations, a part of our bank's business as usual. And so our commitment, and I'll go through kind of the characteristics of it so that you can understand kind of where we're coming from and where we're looking to have an impact. While it mirrors the where we make our philanthropic investments, what is different is this is about business activity and how we are trying to change the way that our firms does business and supports Black and brown communities across the country. So we made a $30 billion commitment that's over 5 years, and that commitment is focused on 4 areas: home ownership and affordable housing. How do we grow small businesses, particularly those led by and serving Black and brown communities? how are we improving the financial health of the communities in which we're working, and how do we, for ourselves, build a more inclusive and diverse workforce. So again, across all those dimensions, we're trying to make sure that this is about our business as well as our philanthropy. But that's just the overall commitment. We also realized that we had to make that commitment local. It wasn't just enough to say, we have this commitment and it will be nebulous and no one knows how it affects them. Because I think often that's the question. That's great, I see these big numbers, and I imagine many of you here today may be wanting to have that same question answered. What does this mean in my community? What does this mean in my city? So following that commitment, we stood up an entire organization to make that commitment local. We, as we're focusing on home ownership, we hired community home lending managers to focus on Black and brown communities. We hired community managers and built community-focused branches with event spaces to bring the community into our actual workspace and put community managers there whose jobs were not just to engage in banking activity, but to actually be proactive, going out and interacting with local organizations, community groups, nonprofits in the same way that we do in our foundation. And finally, we also hired small business consultants, so folks who are focused on working with diverse business owners to give them the technical assistance to grow and scale their businesses. So again, what we're trying to do is make sure that we are not just putting out numbers, but that we are actually putting in place a mechanism for localizing that commitment. One example of that is just here in Washington, D.C. And so last year, following that, we also made a commitment to support this community, both philanthropically and through our business, to the tune of $75 million just in this region. And that commitment, like the overall racial equity commitment, is a mix of philanthropy and business. So we have a philanthropic commitment, but we're also saying we want to make sure that we are supporting affordable housing with flexible, low-cost patient capital. We want to make sure that we're supporting small business owners and entrepreneurs in the same way. So again, that is a broad overview. I look forward to continuing this conversation throughout the day, but thank you again for being here.
Sure. Can everyone hear me? All right. No, I didn't speak up. Okay. Well, Daniel already warmed up the room. Is that better? Okay. I don't have a problem using my voice, although I got a little hoarse over the weekend, so hopefully it holds up. Should I just
click any of it.
Yeah, I don't have a huge presentation, but just to help ground it a little bit. So I'm Ariel Meyerstein. I'm in the U.S. Business Partnerships team within Citi's Community Investing and Development function, which is part of our Global Public Affairs team. I'm based here in D.C. actually. I was formerly in our New York office, and I help lead our Action for Racial Equity, which we announced in September 2020 following the tragic murder of George Floyd. And as Daniel mentioned, all of the events of that year. Very similar to Daniel and JP Morgan, we pulled together a task force within the company to figure out what our response would be, and very quickly decided that it could not stop with mere philanthropy. And I do say mere philanthropy because we very, very much agree with what Daniel said. The view is that philanthropy is necessary, obviously, but it's obviously not enough. And to actually address systemic challenges and long patterns of behavior, you need to really embed practices within the business, and you need to change orientation of the firm and the business to make these commitments part of business, as Daniel said, business as usual. And so our Action for Racial Equity, which we announced in September 2020, really focuses, for the most part, on getting out through our products and services impacts to communities of color. So it's $1 billion plus in strategic commitments. $100 million of that is through our philanthropy, but the other chunk of it is through various pillars of activity, which are outlined on the slide. So expanding access to credit and banking in communities of color, supporting Black entrepreneurs, promoting affordable housing and home ownership. And the last pillar is moving toward getting Citi to work towards becoming an anti-racist institution and to advance anti-racist practices within the financial sector. That's very amorphous, but what it really means is thinking about our policies, our procedures. Where are there areas where we need to be very, much more critical about what we finance or how we review things? It also means thinking about who we engage with as partners, whether it's law firms, PR agencies. So we've developed a whole range of initiatives that really think about the DNA of the company. And this actually, we have a large array of other activity going on with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not actually, formally part of Action for Racial Equity. It's all working alongside of it. So that's a whole other, kind of conversation we can have, but that's not really the focus of this work. This is really about our business processes. I can go now or later into more detail about some of the different pillars, depending on how we want to divide
I
up the
think
time.
we can get to it later in the conversation.
Okay, perfect. So maybe I'll just stop there. Looking forward to hearing your questions and enjoying the conversation.
Great. Well, thank you both for being here. I think it would be probably most appropriate to maybe just have that first initial question talking about methods and approach. So you mentioned earlier that it's important to have or to talk about or even comment on racial equity in the conversation, actually mention it. And to your point about creating an institution that's anti-racist, I'm curious to know, as you were creating these racial equity priorities, what was it that informed your work? If you can maybe take me back to pre-announcement, unless that procedure, your tenure, or as you're thinking about this work now, how does it inform your work? How do you as an institution define not only racial equity but the priorities to kind of really close those racial wealth gaps?
Yeah, so I think number one, Citi's been actively engaged in communities where we do business for a long time. We have a lot of partnerships there and also at the national level. So we have been listening for a very long time. So these issues that we identified for Action for Racial Equity were not new to us. It's not that we woke up in July of 2020 and said, oh gosh, we have to do something about this. It's something that we've been addressing for a long time. It wasn't totally part of the same process, but at the same time, Citi's research team put out a report on racial inequality and kind of tried to put real numbers on the racial wealth gap. And so that report coming out at around the same time is also very informative of the key areas that we would focus. But finally, we also had to think about, well, what is our business? Lots of companies have made commitments, but what can we do through our business and the products and services that we offer to address the issue? And so I think that those were the real guideposts. As I said, these weren't issues that we had not been aware of before. And so we did have a set of priorities that we kind of knew naturally were the areas that we needed to really focus even more. I'd say, so it was a very organic, it wasn't that we had to go out and study the problem for a long time because we really, we knew where we had to focus ourselves already.
Sure.
Similar to what Ariel mentioned, these are communities in which we were already doing business. And I think pre-announcement, one thing we realized is that this is something that has to grow. We have to put our stake in the ground and make a bigger, more specific commitment to racial equity. And also, we are members of the Business Roundtable as that group and the CEOs in that group looked at what they could do with their companies. We studied internally, where can we do more? And so kind of this announcement grew out of that process. But again, we are in, June of 2022. We're just into this commitment. So I think, for many of these institutions, we're still on a journey to get there. And so I think conversations like this are important. And while we made this commitment in 2020, that's not the end of the listening and dialogue that we want to be having.
Mm-hmm. That's great to hear. You both mentioned that this work or this commitment or investment in racial equity has to go beyond just philanthropy, and that the philanthropic work that you're doing actually inspires or it causes you to think about, how you as an institution can kind of change to support this particular work. I would like to talk a little bit or get into a little bit more gritty details around what that actually looks like. How are you marrying what you're doing on the philanthropic side with what's happening on the business side?
Sure, I can take that. Well, so first of all, I think what I would note is that on the philanthropic side, and I manage a team of market-based program officers. So the folks on my team are sitting in communities. They're not in one hub, building relationships from there, but they are walking and talking with folks in the communities in which they're based. So at the outset, what we're doing is building those local relationships. I mentioned some of the teams that we've hired as a part of this commitment, and those teams are working hand in hand with the folks on our philanthropic side. So we don't have one team working in one area of a city or in a subject matter in another. They're working together, often with some of the same organizations, so that we're hearing the same challenges, we're sourcing the same opportunities, we're able to craft collaborative solutions together. And so I think when we look at how we're infusing this into our business, sometimes those relationships start on the philanthropic side, and that is a way to gather information because that's where those relationships exist. But what we're also doing is introducing the folks on our business side and really trying to break down that wall. So I wouldn't have to come here and say the business versus the philanthropic side, but it does start with a lot of local relationship building.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of what we're doing, and I wouldn't say it's a deliberate mirroring per se, but it's more about execution. So as an example, under Pillar 1, expanding access to credit, there's two main buckets of activity there. One is with minority depository institutions, and the other is through a variety of what we call social finance products and services like our Access account. And we also have the Children's Savings Account. And with both of those two programs, we really rely on community partners to help roll them out. With respect to the Children's Savings Account, that's really a partnership with municipalities. And a number of cities already have it in place, San Jose, San Francisco, LA, and we do rely, working with the municipality, but also with partner organizations on the ground to make sure that people know about the account, that they can learn about how to use it and activate it and get started with it. So it's very much a partnership in that way. It is ultimately a business product. The accounts sit with us, but we use the community groups to help execute. Same thing with the Access account. So that's, I think, one element of it. The other element I would say is looking at it more, again, from an ecosystem perspective. Through City Foundation, we've done a tremendous amount of support to community development financial institutions, CDFIs. And that, we're giving unrestricted funding. We also just did a call for proposals, which I can get into later, to support them and their work. But there are potentially other opportunities for us to support them more from a business angle. And so we also developed something called Bridge Built by City, which is an online platform. We developed it internally, all of our own costs. We don't make any money off of it. It's essentially a connection place. We've onboarded almost 30 CDFIs and MDIs onto the platform. And what it does is it creates deal flow for them. So people who want to get small business loans, it extends their reach into communities that they might not be able to reach into, whether they're immediate market or elsewhere, and allows small businesses who otherwise would only be limited to whatever institution might be down the street from them, access to a broader array of CDFIs or MDIs to bank with and to get small business loans. So if you look at it from an ecosystem perspective, with our philanthropic commitments, we can say, okay, we want to support CDFIs that want to do innovative financing or want to help their communities in new ways. But then we have other solutions on the business side that can kind of pick up that activity and help it scale. I wish I could say that that was part of like a grand master plan. Obviously, we're very huge institution and a lot of things going on, but more and more there are people like me working within the bank who are specifically trying to connect those dots so that we can take some little pilots that might happen in one place and another and see how we can learn from those and do something bigger and better on a wider scale.
You mentioned ecosystems and you just mentioned pilots, and it creates this question in my head around, as you are doing this work, how are you approaching this work geographically? Are you finding communities that are most in need of like housing or small business lending products, for example, or just talking a little bit more about how you're thinking about this work geographically? And maybe this is a first question to you, Daniel, since you've committed $75 million to the region. Curious to know how that came about and why this region, et cetera.
Sure. I'll try and take those in order. I think one of the things that we do have priority markets, so we have about 15 priority markets across the country. Those are developed by looking at what are those challenges, what are those opportunities there, where can we have the biggest impact. I think when we look at this work, we want to make sure not that it is, again, like I said, a commitment, but that we're actually able to drive impact. When we look at the greater Washington region, and I know that folks in this room are from all over the country, the racial wealth divide is big in a lot of places. So I'm not saying that DC is bigger or that it's more stark than anywhere else, but it is big and it is stark. And so given that we had focused our efforts here, for those of you familiar with the area, in Ward 7 and Ward 8, we had made a commitment in 2018 of about $20 million to that geography. And we expanded that in subsequent years, looking at a more of a regional inclusive economic model. What would it take to drive a more inclusive economy across the region, recognizing that there are many things that are intertwined: transportation, education, healthcare. Many of those of us who live in this region aren't just affected by what happens in one particular geography. So when we looked at the scale of this geography, we wanted to have a commitment that matched that. And so that is why we looked at the greater Washington region and made that new commitment.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I would say similarly, we're active in 6 major markets across the country, and that is where we try to I would say proportionally focus our energy. We don't necessarily prioritize one market over another. We have a great community relations team that's on the ground, and some of them are in the room today, so say hi to them. But they're operating across the country in those 6 major markets and engaging with communities in those markets, and that's really where we try to roll out the programs. But back to the pilot point, partnerships in particular are very challenging to do, as many of you know, and so sometimes you do have to lead first in one place so that you can get it can happen, you can learn, you can iron out the kinks, and then you can take it elsewhere. And obviously trying to do it in too many places at once from the get-go, it doesn't necessarily work, and you can't learn in the same way. And just from a resources perspective, it's challenging to do that. But back to one other thing I failed to mention in my last comments around the public-private and kind of the boundary, the work that we did during the pandemic with community development financial institutions and other community organizations to help them address the pressing needs that they were seeing on the ground in their communities. We had donated the proceeds from our PPP loan program into the foundation to do that work. So it's $25 million, and so it's kind of going the other direction. But it's another example of how I'd say it's a fluid ecosystem. I keep using the word, but the way the work gets done.
I want to circle back to an earlier point you made around community partnerships or how you're doing community partnerships, Daniel. And when we talk to our members about this particular work and whether or not they are getting access to these funds, if these funds are making impact on the ground, there's a lot of thoughts that resonate around making sure that we have access, right? How do we get into a relationship with our institutions who are doing these major commitments? How do we talk to them about our local priorities and how best to that they could respond? And I'm just curious to know, and maybe you can even provide some examples of how community partnerships on the ground work for this particular work.
Sure. Happy to answer that. And I would say, first of all, you may know or you may not know, on the philanthropic side, we don't have, like some family foundations, open grant applications on our website. I see some heads nod, so maybe some people have looked for that. But like I said earlier, what we do have is we do have individuals and program officers in our markets. What they try and do is have those local meetings with folks. And that's one way that those relationships can be built. One of the other things that I mentioned earlier is as we built out these community impact teams is that we are trying to provide more on-ramps and more relationship points with JP Morgan Chase. So between our small business advisors, our community home lending managers, our community branch managers, there are more opportunities to build those relationships. As far as specific examples, I have many. Some of them are slipping my mind right now. But in this region, we're working in Baltimore with an organization called Parity Homes that is working to build affordable housing in West Baltimore. And that relationship started ultimately through our JP Morgan Chase Policy Center, who was working, looking at housing and appraisal gaps, and the Parity Homes founder, Bree Jones, had really identified a particular issue in Baltimore where homes were appraising for far less than they should. And through our Policy Center, was able to kind of support her work and the work of those in Maryland who are working on that issue. That led to a relationship where Parity Homes and a number of organizations in West Baltimore were recipients of our Advancing Cities grant, so a $5 million grant to support affordable housing in West Baltimore, and in particular, women of color builders and developers. So that's just one particular example of how relationships can start. Josh, you also mentioned pilots, and I think one of the things that we try and work on is kind of a plan, pilot, scale model. So as we look at what's happening in communities, how can we get the data and the information so that we're having an accurate view of what's happening there from the folks on the ground? And then from there, trying to put together what are those collaborative pilots? What is that programming that can start to get at some of those challenges? And then if it's successful, then looking at how do you scale that model, maybe in that community, but maybe in others. So that's a little, I know you talked about methodology earlier. That's one way that we try and look at this, at least on the philanthropic side.
Sure. Did you want to answer that question?
We can move on.
Okay. You mentioned assessing pilots and understanding data around it. And again, there's a question in my head around how do we measure impact of all of this work? Measuring impact of a particular program is hard, at least for nonprofits, maybe with limited capacity to do so. So I'm just curious to know, as you're doing this work, as you're doing homeownership work on the ground or small business lending, what does impact look like for you all? And how are you approaching measuring? You also mentioned earlier that this is still a start of the project, right? You're about 2 years in, still trying to figure this out. But would love to learn a little bit more from the both of you around the approach you're taking to ensure that what you're doing is making impact on the ground.
Sure, and I would say I'd look at this, I think we can look at this in two different buckets. One on our racial equity commitment side and our $30 billion commitment. What is the impact? How are we measuring how that commitment is being met? And so across the 15 target markets that we have, we are constantly collecting data from our business on loans originated, small businesses started, financial health workshops held, and we love a good dashboard. So there are monthly dashboards that contain that information. But I think one of the things too that we're doing is we're also making sure that there's accountability to this. And so our local business leaders and who are leading our lines of business are also asked to be part of operationalizing this. So there isn't one team over here doing this. There's one racial equity team, and then there's our business team. Like I said, we're trying to make this part of our business. So one, there's the kind of how are we're measuring the progress towards that commitment on a monthly and yearly basis. Second, on the philanthropic side, as we look at supporting and our foundation are programmatic funders, so we're funding organizations, programs. We have developed a set of metrics that we ask grantees to look at and say, well, if you're funding in the affordable housing space, which of these metrics do you think your programs will get at? So while there are a menu of them, we are not prescribing every single metric that folks have to meet. And two other things I'll mention. One, we've also started to incorporate qualitative metrics, so not just numbers. What are those things that you think as an organization you're going to do? Tell us what the impact that you think you'll have, and then we can start a conversation from there. Second is we've also started to build in the ability for capacity building and technical assistance. So if an organization says, we want to do this work, we are the best people for this work, we're proximate, we have the programming that we think will get there, but we also need some technical assistance or some capacity building support in this arena. We have the ability to provide that as well. So I think what we're trying to do is not say to organization, here's the bar, either you meet it or we can't have a relationship. But we're really looking at is, what is the impact that needs to happen in this community, and how can we help you to do the work that you're doing there?
Mm-hmm. Coupling investments with technical assistance and strengthening capacity is kind of a really important model, I think, to ensure that investments are just not one time, right, but they're long-term and sustained. And so it's really cool to hear that. Ariel, any thoughts on how you're approaching impact?
Yeah, so I think there's an impact measurement is challenging, obviously. If you're trying to look at the question of are we making a dent, right, in the racial wealth gap? We can see different types of progress in different ways. Some of it, we know that we're doing a lot more activity with diverse financial institutions. So as an example, since 2020, 85% of our bond issuances, city corporate bond issuances for ourselves, have been done with minority broker-dealers. We know that is an uptick over the past. We've always worked with diverse broker-dealers, but it's steadily grown over the years, so we can measure that. We're also engaged, as I noted before, with all the law firms that work on city matters, getting them to measure the representation of the teams that work on our matters and getting them to be more rigorous about that measurement. So that has a ripple effect in terms of how they manage their business. It goes deeper than what they're asked to do by other legal organizations. So we know that we're asking questions that they haven't faced before and getting them to think more critically about it. On the philanthropic side, a lot of the work, I think, has been driven by local needs, in the sense that we do have open calls. So we have done this open call to CDFIs for them to propose their innovative programs and for us to select among them. The work that we're doing with minority depository institutions, that's really been, again, in the spirit of capacity building. So we made equity investments in about 11 of them now, but we're also doing loan participation with them to enable them to generate revenue. But we're also doing a tremendous amount of work with them to develop their capacity and to build their organizations. So some of that you can measure in dollars and cents. We know we made our commitment, and we know the money is going out the door, and we're tracking it, very rigorously. We did agree back last fall to do a racial equity audit, which is focused on Action for Racial Equity. And so we have invited in an external law firm, and they're basically interviewing everyone that's involved with Action for Racial Equity in any way, including external parties that we're working with and supporting to get their view on how we're progressing, if we're doing what we said we would do, what can we learn from what we have done, how can we do it better in the future. We've also issued a number of reports on a 6-month basis, kind of detailing all of the efforts and things that we've been doing. So we've been putting out the information about what's happening. But back to what I said, to kick it off, measuring it, what impact is, I think, is a complex, question, and it kind of depends, in the situation of what you're trying to identify as what you're trying to measure and learn. But a lot of it, I think, is focused on, are we doing more, right, with the different organizations that we've identified, and they may have the metrics that they use to evaluate what they think success is.
As you're thinking about the auditing process and finding ways to evaluate and understand if what we're doing is making an impact, I'm curious to know what innovation looks like. And when we talked about innovation in prep for this call, we thought about it in maybe not necessarily doing a new thing, but really going for what's already happening and whether or not what's already happening is actually making, if it's working, how do we continue to do the work? And so as you're going through this work and you're about 2 years in, are there things that are working well that you feel would, with additional investment or additional energy, can really make an impact in the long term?
In terms of things, working well, I would say the children's savings accounts are, a really great innovation and having a lot of success. And it's really just a matter of, people, enough people to roll it out across the country. It's already in a number of cities, as I mentioned, and does, over the long term, there's research that shows the potential impact in terms of people's likelihood of going to college with savings in place or even thinking about savings. So I think that if we think about the intergenerational problem that we're facing, that's a great example. The other, I think, when we think about innovation, I mentioned Bridge Built by City. That's very innovative. It's a tech platform where we have an impact fund, which is focused. We had the fund before. It was a $150 million fund. We then added another $50 million to it specifically for Black founders. And now a good, almost 40% of the fund is devoted to Black founders. And they're developing a lot of innovative solutions to address social gaps of various kinds: health, infrastructure, transportation, a lot around different ways of accessing financial services, alternative credit models to help to serve people build their credit identities. So there's a lot of innovation happening in different ways, but I think for us, the most innovative thing, which isn't really innovative, actually, is what we started with, which is embedding this in the business. And so all of the work that we're doing with the various diverse financial institutions across the firm, whether it's the minority broker-dealers or the minority depository institutions or diverse asset managers, that's all now being housed under a business team, a unit that's become centralized called our Diverse Financial Institutions Group. And if you look back, the person who's leading that team, Harold Butler, he began working with U.S. Treasury a long time ago on a trainee mentor protege program. And now we have a full secondment program. We've already had one full secondment year. We've got other secondees going out to be chief technology officers at minority depository institutions. So I see that as innovation, because we took this germ of an idea, and now it's a fully funded business team. We've also created another business team in the consumer bank called the Financial Inclusion and Racial Equity Team, and it has the same mandate: market to and develop products for diverse segments in ways that we didn't have this unit before. So one of the, I'd say, positive outgrowths of this intentional focus through Action for Racial Equity is that we are trying to really innovate within the business and change practices.
Sure thing. Did you want to speak on innovation on the ground?
Sure, I can add a little bit to what Ariel said. I think one of the things that we think about when you talk about innovation is, where should innovative solutions come from? And I think one of the things that we try and do is really source that from you all, from the communities that we're working in. So I mentioned earlier the example in Baltimore. We had an annual challenge called Advancing Cities, which awarded 5 to 6, $5 million, 3 to 5 million, 3 to 5 year, $5 million grants for collaboratives that were working in communities to address particular problems. In previous years, that we had kind of two tracks. One was a systems change track, and one was a place-based track. So in the systems change track, what are those innovative solutions that can get at a systemic issue in a particular place? And on the on the place-based track was what are those things that are what are those innovations that can address an acute issue in a hyper-local geography? This year, I think we've recognized that, you know what, as we look at equity, this might, requiring organizations to put together collaboratives may sometimes advantage certain sizes of organizations. So our challenge this year, we've taken a rethink and said, now this challenge is open to individual organizations. And we're focusing on what are those solutions that can accelerate wealth building activities for women of color, knowing that coming out of the pandemic, households that were led by women of color suffered particularly particularly worse than others, and were the least recovered demographic. And so we've said, communities, you tell us what the innovative solution is. And so that's one thing I think about innovation is kind of where do those solutions come from? Secondly, one thing we're trying to do on the business side is make innovative uses of our capital. So we have an impact finance team that actually sits in corporate responsibility. It grew out of our investment bank, and what this team is doing is looking at how do we deploy our capital in new ways. So one, we're making equity investments in early stage companies that are addressing solutions, they're trying to get at solutions for Black and brown communities. But equity investments, those aren't loans, they don't need to be repaid, these are Series A, Series B investments. Secondly, we're looking at, we call it flexible capital, but these are lower than market rate, longer term investments, particularly in the housing space, that allow for some, for access to capital at a different place than our typical market rate. And third, one area that I think we're innovating, at least internally, is we're starting to invest in funds, all within the regulatory framework that we operate under. But what are those, particularly in housing, what are those funds that are working on solutions at scale? And so again, I think those are a number of ways we're trying to think about innovation. But one point, I think we talked about this in our pre-conversation, is that putting innovation in its right place, meaning that everything doesn't have to be innovative. There are solutions that we know work, and so how are we lifting those up, doubling, maybe tripling down on those as well? I think that has to be part of our work as well, and I think we're trying to do that the best we can.
Yeah, I can't underscore enough the need and value to local sourcing, right? Because there are organizations who have been doing this work for years and could just use to amplify or increase their visibility in some ways. I have a forward-focused question, but I may want to pause here and maybe give an opportunity for folks who are in the audience to maybe ask a question to our panelists, and we'll field a few. Gentlemen, since you were first hand raised. Oh, there's a mic right in the back. Yes.
Can I move it forward?
You sure can.
Okay, so hello, great conversation. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I run a foundation called Young Entrepreneurs Foundation, and we go speak to schools all across the country talking about entrepreneurship, but specifically online. My thoughts on the conversation and getting funding is I truly believe that banks are much more favoritism to physical products than online products. So I would want to think, what would be your insight on trying to get some type of funding for a product such as, let's say, for example, we have an eight-year-old YouTuber. He just made $24 million last year, which is a business. Or you have a TikToker that has to fund out different products and stuff like that, which is another business. But I don't think that traditional banks or traditional funders understand that the way that the world is going is digital, and younger people pretty much understand the different products that we can push out. So what would be your thoughts on that?
Sure, and thank you for that for that observation. And one thing I would say is that I think we are starting to understand that. And I know, at least in our philanthropy, that we have supported a number of online, not just portals, but online navigators, particularly around workforce development. So how can we aggregate the resources in a particular area and couple that with a navigator so that folks who are looking for work can access all the resources in one place? But I think you make a very good point. And I think some of the technology is even going away from websites into mobile technology. And I think we as funders and we as a business have to recognize that not all things will be 10 people sitting in a classroom to get programming. And I think that's something that is an important point.
I would just add that, our impact fund, similar to Daniel and JP Morgan's, it is equity investing. It's early seed capital for startup entrepreneurs. A lot of the tools that they are developing are all, app-based technology. So they're not brick and mortar. They might be doing things in the real world, or obviously the work that they're doing has impacts offline, but they are fundamentally kind of in the tech ecosystem, and that's heavily influenced by the involvement of our City Ventures team, which has been part of the Impact Fund and helping it grow. So we're very attuned to that, but it may be though that those are unique, right? There's only some of them, and probably people in your community might have trouble getting what they need to actually go to investors, venture capital, and others, and they might not be looking for that kind of scale, right? So what's that intermediate solution? And I think that it's an important point that you raised that we can take back. I mean, I can't speak to the rate at which we might fund brick and mortar businesses versus things that are online. And from a philanthropic perspective, I don't think we necessarily have a bias one way or the other. Some of the things that we do roll out services through, virtually. So, but I think it's an important thing to keep, to be mindful of, particularly as technology evolves and people use it more and more. It's something that we should always be focused on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Hello.
Hello?
My name is Hamdi Abdul. I am visiting from Seattle, Washington. Definitely, I see most of the work is based on here on the East Coast, but I would like to hear, and what about West Coast or the North or the South, the rest of the country? I hear you saying that, especially Daniel, you said you're investing $30 billion, and we just see that is a very slow process, and 30 billion is not an easy money, it's a big money. But at the same time, we would like to hear at what rate and what speed that money will come, because every minute and every second counts. So that's one question. The second question is there's a slogan that always talks about how to reach people. The question is, who is hard to reach? Everybody gets their money to the bank, whether it's $10 or whether it's $1 billion. I believe that the billionaires and the rich people and the wealthy people and the CEOs are the hard to reach people. They need to be reached, and they need to let us know and follow, the rate and the speed at which this money is going to be dropping and trickling down to the community. If you could say something about that, that would be great.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And one thing that I want to make sure that I'm clear on is that when I talk about our racial equity commitment and our $30 billion commitment, as I said earlier in my opening introduction, this was aimed at getting our impact into our business. And so our $30 billion commitment is a business activity commitment. It is not a $30 billion philanthropic commitment. And I think that's very important to note. Out of that $30 billion, $2 billion of that is tagged for philanthropy. But the remaining $28 billion is for business activity. So how do we increase lending to prospective and current homeowners? How do we make access to capital more readily available for small business owners? So when we talk about the money getting to local communities, that's activated through our bank network, our products, and our services. I can say that as of right now, we've deployed about $18 billion of that $30 billion commitment. We've preserved over 100,000 units of affordable housing. So these things are starting to roll out. To your first question on the West Coast, I manage a team on the East Coast. I have a colleague who sits in San Francisco and manages a similar philanthropic team on the West Coast. But what we're trying to do is work across the country to make sure that we're rolling this racial equity commitment out in the four impact areas that I mentioned. To your second point about hard to reach, I think you're right that CEOs are hard to reach. I think one thing that I'm heartened by at JP Morgan Chase is that our CEO was one of the leaders in internally at driving our racial equity commitment forward. I know it's one of the things that I talked about, loving a good dashboard earlier. I know this is something that he gets a regular report out and has put in some of the accountability structures around that. So we are by no means where we need to be, but we're certainly trying to get there.
Good afternoon. I'm Tammy Thompson from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I have a question. First, I want to say that I commend a lot of corporations for their recent attempts at good D&I work. But I do want to ask more specifically, can you speak to the work that's being done to work with individual team members and their implicit biases that they bring to the workplace that really are some of the drivers of disinvestment in Black communities and Black families?
I can speak to that a little bit. So actually, as I noted before, the Action for Racial Equity itself doesn't include our DEI work, which happens through a separate stream. We do have a Chief Diversity Officer, Erica Irish-Brown, but the work really actually goes back several years. We were the first bank and one of the first companies to do gender and racial pay gap analysis on an adjusted and unadjusted basis, and we set representation goals, which we just met our first round of representation goals for senior employees at Citi earlier this year. So initial starts, at least in terms of addressing the pay gap issue. We also have unconscious bias training. It's part of all employees' training to get unconscious bias training, but there's also been, over the years, special kind of dedicated programs for more senior executives. So I think it's something that we're working on. The last thing I'll say is, as part of Action for Racial Equity, I noted a number of things we've already done with law firms, which is outside of the firm, but we also have, for our Citi mortgage business, been growing our community loan officer network and also trying to work more and more with syndicate banks. So we're trying to develop the expertise in-house to make sure that we can engage with the local communities, but also to think more strategically. And I mentioned, the teams that we created, the Diverse Financial Institutions Group and the Financial Inclusion and Racial Equity teams. They're there to kind of bring that focus. We also developed a team called the Racial Equity in Data and Design Initiative, which is focused on racial bias in products in the design process. And so there's a number of different ways that we're trying to get at that very hard to get at issue.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bridget Tate, and I had a couple of questions. I'm going to try to pare it down, though. Citi, I want to thank both of you for the information that you've shared. I'm coming from a philanthropy kind of question and understanding. Citi, I appreciate all the things that you've noted that the changes that you've made in order to make sure that who you're partnering with is aligned with what you're doing internally. To JP Morgan, my question is, knowing that how philanthropy is done currently with JP Morgan, and that we're continuing to use the word racial equity in this conversation, and that this is just 2 years in the coming based on everything that happened externally, what are you doing, JP Morgan, in regards to making sure that you're elevating and giving access to Black-owned nonprofits, nonprofits that are truly working within community? Because my experience, I've stood here for over 20-something years in this space, is that this particular cycle as far as grant giving means that these are relationships that you've built. We know that money goes to white-run organizations. We know this. So what are we doing to elevate to make sure that because it's not open and you're not, setting up a situation where you're able to partner and have conversations with Black nonprofits, how are you bringing them to the table?
That is.
That's one question.
Sorry, there's a semicolon.
And the second question is, how are you assuring that where your money is currently going in regards to racial equity and what you're doing internally and holding yourself accountable for, how are you holding your grantees accountable for racial equity work? Whether it's in their board, whether it's in the work that they do internally with their staff, and diversity within your senior leadership team. Are you doing anything, do you have any type of tool that you're utilizing when giving grants to assure that the organizations that are white-led are doing the work necessary to get it done and not just poverty pimping from brown communities?
Sure. Thank you for your questions. And those are very important issues, and I think ones that we recognize are issues. So I'll start there. This is not something that I couldn't say, wait, what are you referring to? To your first question, well, let me take your second question first. So we do realize that we need to make sure that we are equitable in our grant making. To that end, we've set some internal goals around our portfolios so that we are prioritizing that the majority of our grant giving will be given to diverse-led organizations. Now, you mentioned leadership, board, et cetera, and so what we've had many conversations over the last year about how do we measure diverse-led? Is it a Black executive director with an all-white board and an all-white program staff? Would you count that as diverse? I see nods, but I think you would probably mean shaking your head. And so we've come up with a definition around senior leadership, around composition of the board, around program staff. So that's one thing. In driving at that commitment, we've also recognized that these aren't easy issues to talk about, and that some organizations may need or want some tools to have those conversations. So as part of getting to that goal, we're starting to look at how do we use our funding to give organizations the ability to do that work that they're identifying themselves. And then the third thing I would say on that is we want to make sure that when organizations do express we want to make sure that our folks are equipped to have those conversations, because those aren't easy conversations as well. And by no means would we ever want to put ourselves in a position to dictate to an organization that says, you need to do this. What we want to say is, what challenges are you having in this arena? What have you seen? What have you experienced? Are there resources that we can help you connect with to do that? So to answer your question pointedly, it is a priority for us, and we're on a journey to get there. To the first point, and the question was long, so if I don't remember it all, forgive me. But I think one thing that I ask the folks on my team is to build those local relationships. We also know that everyone can't meet with everyone. And so while I recognize that is the case, we also want to make sure that we're not being neglectful. And so that's just something for us to pay attention to, is where are these relationships being built? And I think as we look at this diversity goal, we will probably experience some change in portfolios. And that's intentional.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I would just add, it's and through this process, we did also take a really close look at this question of who we're giving to. We have had a longstanding program, and we have someone who's stepping up to the mic who can attest to it, of community progress makers who are local organizations that we give to unrestricted funding to develop solutions in their communities over a number of years. But beyond that, through Action for Racial Equity, as we were looking at, I talked about law firm partnerships and other, folks within the institution that we were evaluating, we also did think very hard about our philanthropy, the leadership of the organizations, tracking it very rigorously, and as in other areas, whether it's diverse asset managers or elsewhere, diverse financial institutions like broker-dealers, how do you determine, what does that mean? What component of the leadership, how do you measure it? And obviously, how do you measure progress? So I think it's something we're still evaluating based on the initial, survey of our current portfolio and how it might need to be tweaked. But it is not easy, and there's no simple solutions. You just pick a black executive director, and you've taken care of the problem.
Thank you for the question. I want to be mindful of time, so we do have time for one more question. So those who are standing, I do apologize. Feel free to connect with me, and we'll make sure your answer. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. How about we entertain this last question, and we'll circle back with you once we dismiss. Just
We're happy
just to be mindful
also
of time.
please come up and
Come up, ask more questions. We'll be here.
So the last speaker triggered a question that I wasn't planning to ask, but since you started it, I'm going to finish it. So yes, my name is Nikki Beasley, Executive Director of Richmond Neighborhood Housing Services in the Bay Area. And yes, we've been funded by both Citi and Chase. Question is the sustainability plan. I can say, being a black woman leading an organization, I've had more opportunity than I've ever had in the 6 years that I've been leading this organization. And without the death of George Floyd, I don't know if I would be in this position today. So my question is, what is going to be the sustainability plan to keep these organizations that so much funds have been infused, which is programmatic, which is grant-based, and when the tide shift, to continue to assist these organizations? But my second question is from an affordable housing lens, and we focus on neighborhood development. A lot of conversation spent on home ownership support, and we're a HUD counseling agency, so we do a good job in getting people qualified. So my offer in innovation would be not just pouring money into down payment assistance and innovative community lending programs, but making funds available to make sure that inventory is affordable for first-time home buyers. Because what tends to happen is the investments are, and I've heard it couple of times, scalable, but in neighborhood developments where you have smaller lots, opportunities that don't tend to be as attractive to the traditional developer could be a great opportunity to secure housing that's affordable for first-time home buyers, especially in high-cost areas. So I would offer that as a suggestion.
Thank you. Do you want to take the first question? I can.
Go ahead.
So thank you for that question and for the suggestion. As to the sustainability plan, I think I can speak from a philanthropic perspective. I don't know that we have plans to decrease our kind of philanthropic levels of spending and grant making. So I think the other thing I would say, as we look at how we want our portfolios to look and who we want to engage, we're not going to be stepping away from communities in which we're engaged now. I think what we want to do is make sure that our partnerships are going deeper. I think what we want to make sure that we're doing is that through both our JP Morgan Chase Foundation, our public engagement organization, which is also focused on building relationships with grassroots organizations, that we are ensuring that our support is permeating down through all levels of the community ecosystem and the nonprofit ecosystem in communities. So I don't know that I have a 5-point sustainability plan, but I do know we have a commitment to the communities in which we're working. And I think one example I gave earlier in this session was just our work here in this region. We started out 3 years ago, you couldn't see a Chase Bank branch anywhere in Washington, D.C. There was just an office on Connecticut Avenue, and you had to be a private bank client to have access to it. Now we have Chase branches. We've made multi-year, multi-million-dollar commitments to some of the most under-resourced neighborhoods, and we've continued to meet those commitments and make new ones. So I think that's an example of how we plan to continue to support work and organizations and communities.
I would just add that, as I noted earlier, this isn't really new work for Citi. We did ramp it up. We did bundle it into this initiative that we thought was necessary to demonstrate the level of seriousness with which we were responding to that moment of crisis. But everything that we're doing is really just a continuation of things that we've been doing for a long time. And so I'm not worried about the sustainability or major retraction, whether from a business perspective or a philanthropic perspective. It's really just kind of continually learning about how to do it better. Obviously, community progress makers didn't exist at a certain point, but now we've been through it a couple times, so we've learned and it's pivoted in different ways. And so I don't have concerns about that, but I definitely understand that it would be very legitimate, fear that eventually the topic kind of fades away into the background again. And obviously we can't let that happen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your time and your questions. I know the events team is going to kill me if I don't end. But we will welcome your question after we close out. I think as part of our evaluating.
Why don't you just
I
ask?
have just one
Sure,
question.
sure.
It's not a lengthy question.
Yes,
How
yes,
about
go
a
ahead.
question? How about a compromise? Please
My
ask your
name-
question so everyone can hear it, but then let's discuss it.
I'm Carolyn Kennedy. I'm Executive Director of the Brotherhood and Sisterhood International Africa Diaspora Directorate. We deal with people nationwide and internationally. You mentioned, Mr. Daniel, that one of the problems that you constantly identify is the underappraisal of properties owned by people of color. And so I'm also a personal real estate investor. I have several properties with Chase. And I want to know, when you identify properties that have been undervalued, which is one of the what's generating methods that people of all colors use, what does the bank do to deal with that problem?
I'm going to answer that as best I can as a non-banker. So what I mentioned earlier, when we identified this issue, we supported a policy solution. So last year, Governor Hogan in Maryland signed into law a bill that would address spending to make up that appraisal gap. So I don't know, and I can't answer this directly, that we have a one-off identification house by house. But when we look at a systemic problem that we can address through a policy solution, we'll try and support that.
Ms. Carolyn, we have an organizing team that does really great work locally around appraisals. We'd love to connect you with the team who's doing some interesting work there, for sure. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate the thoughts.